Kia ora e te whānau. It's Pamela Bell here from the Institute of Building, and you've tuned in to Industry Insights, which is where we do an interactive with an international speaker, and we invert the way we do things. So we're all about asking the questions up front rather than doing a, talking heads presentation, if you like. So here we are at Industry Insights, and you have got a code there at Slido to ask your questions. So make a note of that. It's 4120701. And I'm joined here today with Daryl Patterson. Daryl, thank you. Nice to see you. While we have your photo up on the screen, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm really concerned about that photograph. I'm not quite sure where you dredged it up from, but okay, Pam, great to be here. Thanks for the invite. It's always good to be in Wellington, and really interested to see what the NZIOB is up to. My background, I actually grew up in New Zealand. I trained at the University of Auckland at the School of Architecture. Started work here in New Zealand with an Australian company which was called Civil and Civic at the time, which was part of the Lend-Lease group. And back in about 95 or 96, there was an opportunity for me to take a short-term role in Australia, which they said would be about 6 months, and then they'd repatriate me. And while I was away, they actually closed the New Zealand office, and so the repatriation opportunities evaporated. And I found myself on that side of the Tasman for the last 25, 26 years.
So 6 months turned into 25 years.
Yeah, which I think you have to say is a good thing. I obviously was enjoying something.
Clearly. Yeah. And all with Lend-Lease.
All with Lend-Lease, but a lot of different parts of the group and a lot of different roles. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. And you ended up in the digital space.
Yeah, well, I actually helped create the digital space for the group. So that came from a conversation we were having about 5 years ago. What could we do with technology if we really looked at our business? What do we want to do? How could we reshape the business? And maybe even how could we influence what the industry was doing? It was topical then, it's topical now. And one of the reasons we were asking the question is we were sort of getting a deluge of people coming to us with all kinds of technology and ideas, and we were struggling to make sense of that. So we flipped it around. It was another inversion to say, well, actually forget all of that technology. What do we really want to do with the industry, not the tech?
Right, nice. So that balance in the relationship around influence and leadership. And your time with Lend-Lease Digital, Lend-Lease Podium, I'm not sure of the correct term, has come to an end now. And you're in this interesting free-floating space to carve a new future.
I'm looking at what's next. I've got a few things on the table, but it's been great those last 28 years with Lend-Lease, but it's really overdue time for a change, and I'm looking at some fresh opportunities, both here actually in New Zealand and back in Australia. So open to doing some different things, but building on that experience of the last 28 years.
Awesome. So we should be thinking about the digital brain for hire and how we can make the most of Daryl Patterson. I'll tell you what we'll do though is, I don't want to say short commercial break, but here's a short commercial break. On the digital theme, we've got Building Our Digital Community Conference coming up in March, 23rd of March, which is a beautiful number. I love that one, 23, right here in Wellington, Te Whanganui Atara. And we're hoping to see many of you there because everyone who's tuning into this is interested in that digital space. So we'll see you then. That's brings us nicely onto the broader theme, and I don't think this is a picture of you, but I do detect that productivity is a massive theme in your work. And when we've had conversations before, you've talked about what's driven you, you've just talked now about influence and leadership. Can you tell us a little bit more about how this underpins your work?
Yeah, and we could go a long way back into this, but I think when you and I first met, you were doing a lot of really interesting advocacy in the prefab space, and Lend-Lease had done a lot of interesting things with cross-laminated timber as a material. And we loved the material. We got really excited about it. We built 20+ buildings around the world. But the bottom line with that exciting new material is it wasn't really reducing costs for us, and it wasn't the game changer that we thought it would be. We saw that it had the potential to be, and what we realized is there was a productivity question that was sort of lying at the heart of it. And particularly what was happening is we were making these fantastic prefabricated elements of high quality, great sustainability story, but we're actually incurring a whole new body of work, particularly around the design space, because if you want to precisely manufacture something using digital technologies, all of a sudden the volume of design work ramps up. So the other space we weren't seeing a productivity gain was in the construction side. We're actually seeing construction cycles start to slow down with the use of this prefabricated timber. And that was a great concern to us. So we went really quite deep into both design and the site installation to try and understand how could we get some productivity boost. And that caused us to go on about a 5-year journey to really understand something our industry doesn't seem to spend a lot of time thinking about or talking about, right? We don't do a lot of measuring of productivity. It's not a KPI that we worry about a great deal. And when I say we, I mean the industry and practitioners in it, but also government in Australia, government in New Zealand doesn't really hang a lot of productivity targets on our industry. So we went off and looked at the other industries that productivity is a common topic, and that's pretty much every other industry, particularly the advanced manufacturing industries. And it was interesting to see how they get there and what they do. And one of the things we realized pretty quickly is they don't just throw digital technologies at it. There's certainly a huge digital investment going on around the world in pretty much every industry, and it is there to drive productivity. It's not there for the sake of the tech. I think you've actually
got a slide. Yeah. Tell us about this.
I always hate putting up slides like this because I'm the first person to fall asleep when I see these kind of graphs. But for me, this is really the whole story of what the opportunity is for the industry. And it's worth just going through it and pulling it apart a little bit.
There's a big gap in there.
There's a big gap. Let's start by apologising for the fact that it's US industry data, because the US government is good at measuring this stuff. And as I said, we're less good at it. But what that gap is telling us is most industries, most advanced manufacturing industries in the last 60 years have continued to become more productive by about 2% every year. And I think what's interesting about that, this starts in the 1960s. Manufacturing in the 1960s was pretty much considered to be mature, advanced, as good as it was going to get. We'd had the productivity boost of World War II, had 200 years since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. They had it nailed. And yet what this graph tells you is for the last half century plus, they've continued to improve. And then we look at the red line. Unfortunately, the red line is us. And you can have arguments about the numbers and which part of the industry it relates to and all those sorts of things. And is America different from New Zealand or elsewhere? But the bottom line is, best case, we're kind of treading water, right? We're largely doing what we've always done, and our productivity hasn't really gone up. And this
Are we blaming anyone? Is this a red tape?
Are
we throwing?
I think if you accept the story has gone down, that could be a red tape story. Buildings have become more complex since the 1960s. Regulation has obviously increased massively.
But we should be getting smarter.
Yeah, I think what we're all doing is working a lot harder, but we're not seeing that productivity lift.
Harder, longer. Yeah. Throwing more hours, more people, more resources at things.
And that's your definition of productivity, is how do I actually do more with less, right? Yes. Which actually really nicely links to the sustainability focus that so much of the industry is also trying to pursue. So I guess you have to question, well, what can you do about that? Manufacturing industries have done all sorts of things. They've looked at process, they've looked at materials, they've looked at how people are trained and managed. They've certainly looked at technology, and that's really its big push now is, what can we do with digital technologies to increase the level of productivity and automation? And we're not really on that journey, so we've got to come a long way back and say, well, we can't just build a big shiny factory full of robots. That's not going to get us anywhere. In fact, that's the mistake I think so much of our industry has raced through in the last 5 or 10 years. There's been big dollar investment into really exciting looking factories without getting back to the fundamentals of how do you start to drive this productivity.
Right.
So, we're going to talk about the core principles of digital, and that's not the core principles of IT. We're not going to worry about all those kind of topics, like should you be in the cloud or anything like that. That's kind of at the periphery.
It's a spectrum, isn't it? With the fully robotic factory at one end, but most of us are probably thinking, how do we get started? How do we make baseline digital ubiquitous across the built environment, right?
Yeah, and we probably need to unpack the term digital a little bit, because everything's digital, right? Our phones, our photographs, everything's digital. And so you could make the case, my business is digital. I use BIM, I've got apps for this. I've got, maybe even robotic total stations when we go out and do surveying in the field. And sure, you've got digital elements or aspects into your daily business workflow. What we're trying to get to, back to this productivity piece, is, what is it that digital could leverage in a way that is transformational to the industry? And the other reason we started thinking about this problem 5 years ago, as I said, there was this deluge of technology. Right? There were people showing up at the company door on a regular basis saying, I've got an app and it's going to solve these pain points for you, right? You have quality problems, safety problems, time management problems, cost management problems. My app will fix it, or some other device or technology.
It just might not talk to any other apps.
That's generally the first problem, right? We're creating more problems than we're solving. We're getting these islands of disconnectedness, and a lot of these things required more content to drive them. And, one of the things that over the last 5 years I've become pretty, I guess, annoyed about is, having spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley and also other places around the world doing great stuff, they all want to pitch to you this idea the industry is broken. Right. Oh, the building industry, it's just a mess, it's broken, but we can fix it because we've got this piece of tech. And I think that's the wrong thing to be thinking about.
Yeah, because there are some redeeming elements, right?
The industry's not broken. Yeah. Right. That red line might be trending down, but it's a big industry that's critically important to most of the world's economies. It employs a huge number of diverse talents, right? Really skilled people, and it produces amazing outcomes. Yeah. Now the red line's telling us there's a lot of untapped opportunity. Right, we could be doing it in better ways with fewer materials, more effective use of resources. And if you just want to look at it in terms of bottom line, that means there's profit that someone could be taking from this, or you could be pitching jobs more competitively or some other thing. Attracting
new, interesting, digital literate people into the industry, even.
Exactly, right. I think there is, some aspects of culture that goes along with these technology changes as well. And we've heard the story, I don't know if it's true in New Zealand, but I kept running into the US, that the industry is struggling to attract new entrants, particularly the construction part of the industry. Why would I want to go and work there, right? My father did, my grandfather did. I don't really want to go and work in that kind of archaic, dirty industry. So it is struggling in some regards to get this new talent. But back to those pitches, I don't think we should be telling a story the industry's broken. I think we've just really got to focus on what could digitally do to enhance productivity? And before you even get to digital, what if you've got to put in place that actually makes this possible?
So how do you move along that spectrum from just having a few digital widgets and apps to, you've used words like workflow, before we get to the fully automated factory? So what do some of those steps look like, you think?
Yeah, well, for us, we went back into the physical products, right? Yes. And we also looked at the design process. And I think if you just spend some time on design, design is actually often where the problems start to occur, right? We have an industry where we really celebrate the ability to do bespoke solutions and to customize things and to have really novel design concepts. We run awards on that basis. We train our designers to think that way. And that rewarding of novelty is fantastic in a certain regard, right? It does produce really amazing built form outcomes. And there's a massive market for that. But there's an even bigger market for things done efficiently, done well, right? Schools, hospitals, affordable housing, for example. They don't need novel design, they need really good design that is efficient to produce, right? And when we get into that, we start to see that other industries do the opposite of rewarding novelty. They start to reward consistency, repetition, and they've got a lot of science around this, right? And I think that's the science we need to really think about and be aware of before we get too excited about what we go and make digital.
And any industries in particular?
Well, just about every other industry, but the examples we can look at are often drawn out of automotive, and I think there's some good ones there. But we can look at electronics or appliances or anything like that, and just see the gains that have been made. What you get, particularly in retail, are concepts like SKU minimization. So SKUs, SKUs, stock keeping units for those who've never run across SKUs before. One of the principles, starting out of retail, but now deeply across manufacturing, is we want to minimize SKUs.
Sure.
Right?
Minimise complexity.
Minimize complexity, right? So if we look at our industry, we're kind of going the other way and we're saying, well, no, this building is going to be different. And maybe even this part of this building is going to be different from that part of it. And the team that we put together is going to be different. And who we buy it from is going to be different. And we're not doing anything to try and minimize SKUs. We're going in the opposite direction, saying, let's just make it all as different as it can be.
It's a bit like the red tape thing, isn't it? I remember out of the Japanese prefabrication industry, where Toyota creates cars and creates homes, with a car, there's 2,000 parts or SKUs, and in a home, there's 20,000.
Right.
So the scale transfer is huge.
Yeah, and I think when you start getting into large commercial projects, multi-story office buildings,
20 million parts.
easily.
Yeah.
Right. Never to be used again, by the way.
Right. Yes, custom for this project.
That's right. So, okay, SKUs, that makes sense. Try and get rid of some of the complexity. And if you're trying to digitize something, then don't start by digitizing something complex. Try and start in a more simple way. But then one of the next things that we sort of learned was this whole theory, which has a name called Wright's Law, right? And that's really just about a learning effect. And Wright's Law says that if I make 1,000 standard SKUs and I go off and I get an order for 2,000, doubling that volume of parts, if I put some thinking into how I will double that volume of parts, I will generally reduce my cost base by 20%. That theory has been proven in over 20 different industries in the last 50 years. And it is almost always true. There's some variability around the percentage of savings, but basically if you double the number of parts, you will reduce the cost of those parts by 20%. And it's simply a learning effect that washes through from the people who design them, to make them, to buy them, to install them. They get smart about how to do it. They think of shortcuts. They think of ways to automate. And that's where you want to start plugging digital in. You say, okay, if I've got that kind of thinking going on and I'm going to use the same design solution over and over again with great repetition and intelligence, how do I capture that digitally and make sure that someone doesn't come along and fiddle with it?
So if I procure the same house as my neighbour, I should get a 20% saving.
Well, that's essentially what Wright's Law is saying. That if I was building that kind of volume, I should be driving that kind
much like the villa and bungalow pattern book.
Sure. Yeah. So it is a kind of back to the future in a way.
And you talked about cars, and I just mentioned that word pattern book. But can you tell us a little bit about the role of platforms and plug and play in this, novel or custom versus efficient reuse?
Yeah. I think
delicate balance.
There's a lot of language that's emerging at the moment, and some of it's just it's there for the people trying to sell technology. But
sure,
try and cut through some of that. I think one thing the industry is talking a lot about at the moment is this concept of a kit of parts, right? And it's not a bad concept, but for me, it's a little bit incomplete. Like you could turn any building into a bunch of parts. So what?
And, and there's some social, historical misperceptions around what kit means, right? Because it can mean cheap, flimsy.
Can mean all those things.
Yeah.
I think platform, it's not just a different word for that. It's actually implying there's a little bit more thinking going in behind those parts, right? A platform says if I have access to a range of components, I have rules about how I can combine them, right? And maybe I can combine them dozens of ways or thousands of ways. And it also has rules about what I can't do, right? Like don't change this part, because if I change that part, I make the whole solution invalid. So platform in the digital sense is a really important concept. And when we start looking around what's happening in the world, we see a lot of people going after platforms to support technology. And this example on the screen here is actually from the Volkswagen automotive group. They came out with their first major platform back in around 2012. Now, this is the big end of town. These guys spent $8 billion coming up with this platform.
On their platform.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's actually quite an intriguing thing. So what that diagram there is showing is that basically the whole car is variable. You can change the design of what's in the middle, what's at the front, and what's at the end. But there's this piece that's highlighted in blue there, which is unified and must be consistent. And they chose that piece very carefully because they did deep analysis on where they spent money in design. And 60% of the engineering cost of the car happens between the front axle and the gas pedal. So they said, well, hang on, what we should do is use that same 60% over and over again and not change it, right?
I feel like that's our utility areas. our bathrooms and kitchens and
It could be.
laundries and pipes and ductwork.
I couldn't give you a definitive answer on that. We looked at a lot of that stuff, and it could be the structural solutions, it could be the services, but I think that's what the industry can go and explore. And for these guys, it was, well, we've got all the engine mounts and steering and suspension happening in there, so that's complex. Don't change the complex bit, use it. And they use this on 11 different brands and 10 different body styles. And it's been so successful, they're on their second version of this platform. And they don't just have one platform, right? This is their platform for transverse engines, right? They have another one for longitudinal engines. I don't know what they spend on that. But the concept that you can have multiple platforms, but platforms are very systemic in terms of what is variable, what is fixed, what are the parts in the kit. And their designers have got a considerable amount of freedom to make a really great range of car products for us to buy. But they've also got some very controlling pieces to, you cannot change this. And obviously to manage that in a global business, they use technology very carefully to control that system, that platform.
And how are you seeing this platform and plug and play approach around the world? And how are you seeing this being used?
We're seeing businesses get spun up on this concept. Modulus in the UK and the US is essentially a version of this. They're saying, well, we're a whole turnkey provision of a building. So you can buy a solution from us made from components like these cars are. And some of those components will be very unique to where that building gets built. If it's in Wellington or San Francisco, it needs different components, obviously. Some of those components are not unique and should be the same everywhere we go for cost efficiency.
And are these companies that are getting started, are they actually owning any part of this manufacture, or are they
that's a
assembling?
really good question. So, I've looked at maybe a dozen different firms doing this. The early ones said, we want to own all the manufacture. It's really important. We want to spin up our factories.
Right.
The later ones have said, oh, no, that's actually a terrible idea, right? There's a global supply chain out there that can make things, right? We should use that. We shouldn't try and necessarily build our own factories. What we should be is platform owners. We should set the rules of the platform. We should create the digital technology where people come and use the platform. And we should let the manufacturing industries and suppliers do what they do, right? Come to our platform with their components.
So that puts the onus on the rules or the agreement of the standards.
It does, yeah. Which is, if you come back to cars, that's what's going on there, right? They're setting the rules to say, we need these electronic components, we need these brake components. They're not making those components. They're just defining the system rules.
Right, having a really tight scope. And I know I've seen presentations where you've had great pictures of a Boeing fuselage and all the pieces and parts come in from external providers. They're simply plugging and playing.
They are. Now we're a long way from this. I've had debates with people who say, we've got standards and we've got consistency in our industry. We're not talking about a standard for the quality of timber or something like that. We're talking about literally plug and play. If I had these interfaces defined, I could buy my component from any one of a dozen manufacturers and I could just plug it into my building and it would work.
Your whole HVAC system, your whole bathroom utility system.
Even a door into a wall or a window into a wall. We know that doesn't actually happen today. Some designer has to think it through.
Windows are measured at site and then custom made. It's mind blowing. Cool. So I guess in terms of that approach, what does the plug and play approach mean for the future of collaboration or cooperation or co-opetition? I mean, how should we be thinking about open source at the scale of our businesses?
I think that's one of the big questions facing the industry, because what is happening right now is everyone's saying, I'm going to have my platform, right? I'm going to be like Volkswagen. I'm going to grow my own platform. And the question I'd have is, so that's fine, you can do that. And there's companies doing that, but
then we're just being custom all over again, aren't we?
Well, I think there's a question about how much can you afford to spend to create one of these platforms?
Not 8 billion.
No.
Well, what about, because we've just come out of a digital hui this morning, where we are getting digital and BIM or building information modelling groups alongside BIM and NZ together to understand what common standards we need around data, around guidelines, design guides, scopes, contract, procurement. So is there a digital platform as opposed to an actual literal built slab? Is there a digital platform of standard things?
Yeah,
and what does that look like? Or where do we find this nirvana?
I think those are just in the earliest days, right?
Yeah.
I think there are organisations like Digital Built Britain that are really thinking about those questions.
So they're the ones at the forefront.
They are doing that thinking. I mean, they've obviously got a lot of alignment to central government, who is interested in seeing that productivity curve increase.
Right.
But they're trying to think about what are the rules of platforms, plural, right? So
Yes.
you can have as many as you like, provided you can afford to build them. But to be a platform, they need to operate like this to encourage that efficiency. But I think where it starts, back to your open source question, you actually have to work across industry. You've got to bring suppliers and designers and general contractors together, and you've actually got to have a bit of debate. And there's winners and losers in that debate. I think the manufacturing side of supply would say, please bring it on, because we could be much more productive, right? Designers might struggle with the shift in paradigm. Some in the building side of it might say, hang on a minute, the opportunity to make a buck here is shifting. Is it still with me? Is it somewhere else? So you've kind of got to get in the room and start to get past what the current commercial models look like and start thinking about the future models.
Yeah. So we've got to get everyone in the room and government on board. Luckily here we've got something called the Construction Sector Accord, and there's a pledge to support innovation in digital, and luckily they're in the room, which is really good. I guess then it's what else do you need other than the platform? And I know we've talked about prototypes and pipelines, and how do we kind of prove this, and what else do we need to make this successful? What does good look like?
Yeah, I think again, I'm still cautious about at that point leaping off into a technology. Someone will say, but BIM will do that, or this will do that, or I've got a new app, right? Or AI is going to solve those problems. And
right.
That can all be true, but I think really what we've got to look at and say, what we're talking about now is pretty transformational across the industry. Would you really go to plug and play? Would you really manufacture more of a building? Would you really have a platform? And if you're going to have that kind of transformation, you've got to think really carefully about what the catalyst opportunities are for it. Now, you jokingly said, well, if I got a house next door to one that's already been built, would I get a 20% reduction? The reality is, if you literally just had a second house, probably not, because you haven't got the scale to really get the ideas working through to get the learning effect. But if you're the government and you're deploying, like they are in New South Wales at the moment, 500 teaching spaces, i.e. a classroom or a gymnasium, per annum for the next 10 years, you've got this truly enormous pipeline of opportunity to drive the learning effects, to drive the productivity. So the question, I think, is if you want this kind of shift and you really want to drive it with digital, it's what are the right opportunities? It's not the one-off bespoke house. It's not even the single office building.
You mentioned scale, something we sometimes struggle with in New Zealand due to our intimate population size. I wonder how we can break down to a repeatable part that might not be the building. And I know you've done some work at Lendlease around, click together systems, mass timber. I mean, is there a repetition somewhere that New Zealand should be thinking about that might not be at the scale of, well, it might not be hospitals, it could be school classrooms, like you said?
I think the scale question is often, there's a lot of wrong assumptions around it, right? When I say something like an education program of 500 spaces per annum, those spaces are all different, right? Some of them are classrooms, some will be, woodwork rooms, for example. So are they all
But there'll be a consistency of platform.
There will, and what you do to drive that is you do come down and scale and look at individual components. And so what we did is we said, well, we build a lot of multi-story structures, so let's look at how the beams and columns and slabs come together. What are the connection points there? And so often with prefabricated solutions, you see wonderful things being delivered to site and then an intense effort to actually hook them together. So we said, well, that's actually just got to connect, much like the simplest platform we're all familiar with, which would be Lego, right? It's really just got to push together in a way that anyone can do it and you can't do it wrong. And you go one step further and you ask the question, well, if I can connect it that way, could I disconnect it the same way, right? And so if you take the care to design that kind of assembly process, you get disassembly as well. And I think that's going to be an important concept for us going forward. Yeah.
Design for disassembly.
Design for disassembly. I think that gives rise to a whole bunch of things.
In a sustainability context, a reuse context. Yeah. Circularity. Yeah.
Yeah, so you are now down at a very granular scale. You're starting to think about a column connecting to a beam, and the work that I was doing with Lend-Lease, we actually did all the engineering work in Christchurch, right? So New Zealand was the origin for the solutions that we put in place.
Is that a shout out to Home Solutions?
Home Solutions, yeah, did fantastic work for us,
Cool.
and they just bring the right thinking against it. So you don't need to be in the world's largest economy to put these solutions together. You just need to get down to the right scale and put the right people around it. And I think the thing that gets overlooked with New Zealand so often, and I only see this having been out of the country for a long time, it is actually simpler to try these things out in New Zealand. It's not as simple as it once was. There's more, there's more bureaucracy than there used to be. You've got a pretty benign insurance environment here. You've got a great cultural climate for trying things, right? And that's just not true in a lot of the world's major economies. They're very fossilized. They're bound by regulation. They're terrified of insurance outcomes from adverse issues.
Oh,
so
great.
they just won't try it. I think we'll try it here, right? And so the scale question actually should be put aside in favour of, well, actually, how do we go after IP, not scale, right?
Right. That's a really good point, because New Zealand is a place to prototype for the world, right? So we are the home of IP. And when we're talking just then about circularity and reuse, it made me think of the X-frame story, which is this lovely digitally fabricated wall system. So again, it's about the IP story. It can be made anywhere. It's just a digital file, right? Yeah. Hey, one other replication thing we've talked about before is the reuse of people. Can you tell us a bit more about repetition?
Yeah, I think it stems back to what I was saying about design, right? We like to go bespoke, but then we also have this commercial model where we believe that we'll get competitive value from tendering, right? What do we get out of that? A different team on every job, right? Different suppliers, different contractors. Even the contract firm or supply firm will have different people working on it.
Different retained learning.
Yeah. And I've been on so many projects where, at the 2-year mark, when you're just getting to wrap up the project, everyone says, oh, this is really going well now. We sort of understand each other and we figured out what they're trying to do and what I'm trying to do, and we speak a common language. And then you disband and you never work with those people ever again. Or you certainly never get that same configuration of team. You might bump into a few of the players on another project. And the question I've got is, if you actually did start to build consistency in teams, would you get more of that learning effect that you get from components? And would that be greater value than the so-called competitive tension coming from a tendering process? And I suspect when you look at the way other industries operate, the answer is emphatically yes. There's more money from having the dream team do the job multiple times and become the team of champions than there is this kind of assemble a team and hope for the best each job.
Right. I think we have some trouble here keeping people together because we're in such a changing inflationary poaching type environment that teams kind of assemble and disassemble and then turn up somewhere else. But I can just see some questions coming through on Slido. Folks, we're going to move to those pretty soon. And that number is 4120701. But lastly, we just thought, anything top of mind, Daryl, around trends you're seeing globally around the broader innovation space, green, digital?
There is an enormous
about?
amount going on. I mean, the most fun I've had in the last 5 years has been traveling the world pre-COVID and meeting with an incredible number of businesses that are emerging.
Is there anyone we need to be watching?
Oh, there's a lot. So there's people.
We can put things in the show notes afterwards as well.
There's people in what we would classify as the design automation space, and you may have run across some of the names like Archistar and TestFit and Giraffe and SpaceMaker AI, which has been acquired by.
We're definitely going to write those.
Right. So we'll get these names out to you. But
Giraffe, yeah, okay, got it.
They've thought about the front end of a project, and they've said, well, what if you could create concepts really quickly, see if they match the planning requirements of the location, and then do the financial analysis and have all that happen in a few minutes. And that's a version of what we were doing as well in my last role. they're very interesting things, but they actually stop most of them at that point. They just get you to that very quick early concept. And so they're very exciting for the first 5 minutes. And then you go, well, what's next? That product doesn't actually help me go further. That's when the next wave of stuff I think is coming will be even more interesting. And it's likely to be AI driven, which is actually automating all of the subcomponents of design, right? And a lot of us are familiar with this thing, computational design, which has been around for about 20 years, right? You know, these tools like Grasshopper and Dynamo. And we've seen really radical buildings created using those tools. The Frank Gehry type stuff.
Push and pull, automatically. Yeah.
What we're seeing now is those tools being pointed the other way to say, how do we actually solve more mundane problems using those automations? Now, what is only just beginning to happen, and my former team was doing a lot of this work, is we're combining those tasks. So instead of just having a tool that can create a facade or a tool that can analyze the size of a beam, we start putting them all together and they talk to each other, and we start to automate a lot of the rules of design.
It's automating the rules again, just what you said with platforms. Yeah.
I think what I haven't seen much of yet, but the potential is there, and you know, there's been a lot of talk in the last couple of months about ChatGPT.
Yes.
Right. To see that same kind of AI approach go into three-dimensional design, right? So instead of being text-based, how can it start to explore design solutions? We actually have a research project running in Melbourne at the moment that's on exactly that. It's how do we let AI recommend or propose concepts and then try and marry those to those rules-based algorithms from computational design. So, okay, if you like this form of building, here's a structure which will make that form possible. And I think you're going to see a lot of that in the next 5 years.
That's going to be fascinating.
Yeah.
You know, take this standard, take this guideline, create something for me. I'm interested in how ChatGPT might be a much better search engine than Google for the reuse of find that drain detail, find that thing in that project that we did once that worked. We've got no idea how to find it because you know, Jane did it and we can't find Jane now. She's gone on to something else. So, you know, instead of storing information in our heads, you know, how can we at individual levels or small enterprises be fundamentally creating a database of reusable pieces of parts?
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing about AI and why we shouldn't be necessarily concerned about losing our jobs. It's a learning capability that we can leverage, right? Because
all that time finding things in files.
We can't learn all that stuff, and we can't find it all. So if something's going to go off and do that work for us, I think that's great.
100%.
I think the green space is interesting. Obviously, it's being pushed by regulation in some markets more than others. But you know, what we're saying,
Scotland do this passive house mandate. It's going to be interesting.
What we see is that potential for a real circular economy to emerge. Right? Talked about designing for disassembly. You go back to the automotive industry; it's got a massive market out there for parts. Right?
Yeah.
And cars get downcycled that way quite extensively. Right? We don't really have that in the built environment. Sure, there are salvage firms that will take parts of buildings. We do try and recycle materials. We don't
They're more socially driven than commercially driven currently.
Well, even if they're commercially driven, you tend to get a part out in a destructive or a material out in a destructive way, and it's not probably going to be fit for reuse in another building.
Right.
And I think that's the opportunity for us to say, well, if there's a piece of structure of a building, but the purpose of the building's changed, maybe the structural piece is still perfectly valid for another 100 years. So why can't I use it that way?
As I've heard an Australian say at an American event, we need to use the spanner, not the hammer, which was slightly lost on them because they use a wrench.
Okay.
But anyway, but that's the same principle, isn't it? Create things in a way that we can uncreate them. Yeah. And reuse them.
Yeah.
Anything else in that green space? You know, there's waste, there's you're right, we are seeing some increased regulation here. We've got a whole, you know, building for climate change piece through MB, and our next industry insights is going to bring those speakers in to talk to that space. But is there anything else you're seeing out there where maybe digital and green are combining around that, I don't know, carbon footprint?
Well, I think what we've become more capable of and much more interested in is the total life cycle of things. Right. So
as a carbon calculation.
Yeah. Where did the tree come from? Right. Where did the steel come from? How was the steel produced?
How bad am I? How bad is my building?
What's the reality of all of that? And that plays off in other things that we should be very interested in, like quality and safety, for example. Have we got a supply chain that's, you know, a legitimate supply chain and it's free of, you know, slave labor, for example?
Mm-hmm.
Without digital tools to track that sort of stuff, how would you know, right?
Cool. I have got a couple of questions that will go here, and we'll call them emerging themes. She says, dancing around the slides a bit. So here on our Slido, we've got a couple of questions come through, some more serious than others, I'll be honest. But I'm interested, we've talked a bit about AI. We've talked about the themes that we're seeing around. I guess, you know, specifically Lindley's podium question is, you know, what was the intention there? What was Lindley's podium trying to do that you think is worth sharing with this group? Or have you covered that with the platform?
I think, you know, it was trying to get to a platform. It still is. I'm not there, but the podium effort is certainly continuing. It was easy to misunderstand that as, oh, you're trying to automate design and do away with designers, right? Far from it. It was trying to actually give designers tools they could leverage to be much more productive and to explore many more solutions and to find more optimal outcomes than just assuming the few that they had time to work on were the best ones. We also wanted to bridge what I see as a divide between how things are designed and how they're made. Right? Well, we've kind of that's a problem with the modern world, that the people who design things often don't have a lot of hands-on experience with how they're made, and makers don't know much about what the designer's intent was.
Yes.
And there's huge amounts of lost in translation between the two.
Yes.
And I think we can start to reconnect that a little bit. We can bring that knowledge of making back to the designers through these platforms, right?
Yes, and it seems like Lendlease was well positioned to look at the overall picture. What someone's asked here is, if you were to zero in on the most inefficient part of the design construction process, is there a piece that you think we should be starting with or focusing on?
Well, I always start with the design piece, right? Because you're creating the roadmap for how everything's going to go. What we see with design, and we've all experienced it, there's nothing wrong with any of the individuals involved or the firms involved, but there's this challenge of coordinating and communicating, and design moves on by the architect, and the person doing the mechanical cooling system is 3 weeks out of the loop. And when you try and re-coordinate all of that, you know, you just see this massive rolling inefficiency through the design evolution, right? And
so digital and that one sort of source of truth, you know, the BIM model should be a way to work around that coordination.
Yeah, but I think BIM's gone a long way into it. I think we've got to also look at, you know, what are the communication processes and decision processes, and how do all those decisions get connected to the right people at exactly the right time?
Yeah.
I think if you looked at the software industry, they've built purpose tools for doing that. I mean, we've heard about the Atlassian story in Australia. It's one of the unicorn technology companies, because it makes a product called Confluence, which just connects software engineers together so they're in sync when they're designing a new software product. I don't think BIM's quite got us there yet in terms of syncing everybody out. You know?
The interoperability piece is not. Or is this because we are too resistant to agree on the common standard?
I don't think we've tried to tackle that problem.
Okay, right. So that's something we could do better. Yeah, there's a lot in this, isn't there? For example, this morning I got an email from a friend who's an architect in Norway, Kiwi architect, and she mentioned that they have just delivered at their architecture firm a large commercial project completely digitally, no paper drawings. Are you seeing this around the world?
I think we've just had a big catalysm of that through COVID, right? We couldn't even go and physically sit in offices. It took some value away because, you know, we're sitting in this room here, you can't see it on camera, but we're surrounded by whiteboards and paper, and it's fantastic. And, you know, you can go and have a conversation around anything on the wall. We lost that during the pandemic. And so we were forced into, how do we find ways to work together digitally? And that has shifted a lot of people into that space you're describing. I would like to see it go further and say, well, if we've got all of the work happening digitally to start with, how do we fabricate it digitally? How do we manage the construction process digitally? And that's another big divide we've got at the moment, right? If construction is being run a certain way, and say there are problems coming out of it that are fundamentally driven by the design, sure, there might be noise about the issues, but do we really get the data coming back to the designers to say, if you design it this way, the problem wouldn't be there, right? And so that's the true, fully digitally delivered project. And I haven't seen that yet. Right? I think that's still to come.
We are going to have to wrap up, but as we wrap up, I'd like to ask, if we're trying to improve productivity, how will we know we've got there? What should we be measuring? And can we agree on a productivity metric, or what would you suggest we do?
It sounds like a whole committee has to be spun up around productivity measures.
No more committees.
No more committees. Well, I think maybe that's something that your members are interested in posing that question. What are the right things to measure in productivity?
Yeah.
Is it as simple as the number of designers involved in the job? Is it the number of workers on a construction site? Is it the number of firms involved in a project? But it's got to come back to that. Are we doing more with less? Right?
Yeah. Number of people who are still friends at the end of the project. Number of people smiling. Talking about smiling and meeting friends. Daryl, thank you so much for being part of this Industry Insights. I'm only wrapping up because I'm aware of time. We could keep talking. I hope we do keep talking and once we stop rolling. We are hoping to see many of you who we can't see right at the minute, but at our Building Our Digital Community event in Wellington on the 23rd of March. And we do hope you'll tune in again in about a month's time. 2nd of March, we'll be talking green and innovation with Sam Archer from the Green Building Council and Antonia Reid from Building for Climate Change. So when we haven't got international insights through Industry Insights, we're going to bring you viewpoints from around the country. So Antonia's in Wellington and Sam's in Auckland. So thanks very much for today, Daryl. Whoops, she says. And I just want to say, ka kite ana. We'll see you next time.